For 3,000 years, it was ignored, just another crumbling wall in a forgotten temple. Archaeologists called it decorative, incomplete, unimportant. But what if I told you, it wasn't a poem? It wasn't a prayer? It was a warning. And now, after centuries of silence, someone has finally decoded it. In 2023, a team of linguists and AI researchers in southern Egypt made a discovery they weren't supposed to find. An ancient inscription, buried under layers of plaster, written in a language no one had ever seen. At first, they thought it was just another variation of Old Egyptian. But as the symbols were digitally reconstructed, a different message began to emerge. A message older than the pyramids. A message so disturbing, parts of it were immediately blacked out in the academic release. Because this wasn't about kings or gods. This was about something else. Something Egypt wanted to forget. The wall no one paid attention to. The temple sits in the ruins of El Katara, a name almost no one outside Egypt has heard. Unlike the grand tombs of Giza or the mythic sprawl of Luxor, El Katara was thought to be provincial, unimportant. Just another sun-bleached cluster of stone and sand half swallowed by time. Tucked behind the main chamber, there was a narrow passage, one that archaeologists had passed by for decades. On one side of the passage, a long wall covered in faded carvings, chipped and worn. Some sections had been plastered over, likely by later dynasties. The glyphs seemed jumbled, unfinished, even repetitive. A list of offerings, maybe. A hymn fragment. No one thought it mattered. Until a graduate student in 2022, reviewing old infrared scans, noticed something strange. Some of the hieroglyphs weren't just faded. They were layered. Under the visible writing, there was another script. Something else had been intentionally buried. The team returned with next-gen scanning equipment, multispectral lasers, AI pattern mapping, 3D linguistic reconstruction. And slowly, a new set of glyphs began to emerge. But they didn't match any known dialect of Middle or Old Egyptian. They weren't phonetic. They weren't pictorial. They were encrypted. A language hidden inside the language. At first glance, the glyphs looked familiar, but not quite right. They curved where Egyptian symbols should be straight. They flowed like water rather than standing rigid. And most importantly, they overlapped, one symbol partially carved over another, forming what scholars described as glyphs within glyphs. It wasn't sloppiness. It was deliberate. One Egyptologist likened it to a sentence hidden inside a painting. You could stare at it for hours, and unless you knew exactly what to look for, you'd never realize it was there. This wasn't just ancient writing. It was a puzzle. For weeks, the team at El Katara struggled to decode the pattern. The AI kept flagging symbols as incomplete syntax, fragments of words from multiple linguistic systems layered atop one another. It wasn't just Old Egyptian. It included Proto-Semitic structures, Berber glyphs, and even visual patterns resembling Sumerian cuneiform. Some were inverted, written backwards, or spiraled in a circular structure that forced the reader to rotate the image like a wheel. It was a trapdoor language. And finally, someone fell through. It happened late one night in the Cairo lab. Dr. Safiya Nasser, a linguistic cryptographer fluent in 7 dead languages, tried something radical. She stopped treating the text like speech and started treating it like a ritual. She rearranged the symbols based on frequency of emotional terms: fear, silence, darkness, absence. The result? A single, coherent phrase surfaced. "We were warned." The room went silent. Excited, but cautious, Safiya began to follow the sequence downward, not left to right, but in a spiral, the way early tombs were designed, inward, like a descent. The deeper she read, the more the tone changed. It wasn't a hymn. It wasn't a record. It was a testimony. Someone, thousands of years ago, had etched a personal account into the walls. An account hidden inside a public inscription, masked to look harmless to passing priests or officials. But beneath the mask was fear. She found references to the sky that cracked, the gods that fled, and the thing that descended, wearing no skin. Now the entire team was involved. Translation went around the clock. And with every new section decrypted, the implications grew darker. Because the next phrase wasn't symbolic. It was literal. They descended on wings not of flesh. The first line translated, They came from the sky. It began with a single, unassuming glyph. A stylized bird, not uncommon in Egyptian writing. But this one was different. Its wings were stretched straight upward, not outward, and its body was marked by 6 tiny indentations. Beneath it, a spiral. Then, a pair of eyes. But not human eyes. Slanted. Elongated. Watching. When Sophia completed the full phrase, her hands trembled. They descended on wings not of flesh. Not birds. Not gods. Something else. The next sentence was even more haunting. When the stars broke, they came through the wound in the sky. The team stared at the translation. At first, they thought it might be poetic, a reference to a solar eclipse or meteor shower. But the details kept coming. They spoke no tongue, yet all heard. Their heads held light. Their fingers bent wrong. This wasn't symbolic. This was descriptive. And then the scroll described something Egyptologists had never seen in religious texts. The gods ran. The falcon fled. The ibis wept. The jackal buried his face beneath the sand. That alone was unheard of. In Egyptian theology, the gods are unshakable, eternal. They don't run. But here, the gods, Ra, Thoth, Anubis, weren't in control. They were terrified. As if something older than them had arrived. As if they were no longer in charge. One chilling passage described the Nile turning black. Not metaphorically, literally. Its waters recoiled. Fish surfaced. Then stillness. Other lines mentioned the sun disappearing for 9 nights, and entire villages where voices fell silent before the mouths did. It was as though reality itself had bent. Broken. And someone was trying to document it before it disappeared forever. The most disturbing line so far came near the center of the spiral. They did not walk. They did not breathe. And still, they watched. Whatever they were. They weren't alive in the way we understand life. And yet they moved. Observed. Altered. But the real terror came from what the wall didn't say. It never explained where they came from. It never told what they wanted, only what happened after. And according to the next section, what followed was worse than death. Warnings of a great silence. Then came the silence. Not of wind, not of sand, not of death. The silence that eats time. That's the line that stopped Sophia cold. Because it wasn't a metaphor. The glyphs were clear, the silence wasn't around them. It was inside them. The inscription described a phenomenon that even the most seasoned Egyptologists couldn't make sense of. Entire villages where people stopped speaking, not out of fear, not out of grief, but because they forgot how. One passage read, "The tongue was known, but the sound was lost." Words cracked like empty shells. Some began to walk in circles, the writing said, as if searching for something they couldn't name. Others stared at the sun for hours, unmoving. One chilling verse. He held his daughter's hand for days. She was dead. He did not know. Then came the glyph that Sophia later called the most horrifying of them all. A simple figure, a human silhouette, but hollowed out. No face. No heart. No bones. Just an outline. Beneath it, for symbols repeated over and over again. The self erased. The self erased. The self erased. According to the translation, this was the fate of those who stayed too long in the presence of the Skyborn. Not death. Not possession. Erasure. Memories crumbled. Identity collapsed. Time bled like ink in water. People forgot who they were. They became shells, walking, breathing, but utterly hollow. No past. No will. Just presence. The manuscript called it the silence that eats time. And it claimed it spread like a fog, rolling from one village to the next. Animals fled. Crops withered. Not from fire or drought, but as if the land itself forgot how to live. It reads like mythology. But then Sophia noticed something else. At the base of the wall, beneath the final line of the silence passage, was a symbol for witness. And next to it, a carved hand. Life-sized. Realistic. It wasn't hieroglyphic. It was human. pressed into the stone, as if someone, whoever had recorded this, had finished their account and left behind their final trace. It wasn't just a message. It was a confession. Physical evidence found nearby. It was one thing to read about erasure, silence, and watchers from the sky. But then they started digging, and what they found buried in the sand changed everything. While Sophia's team worked on decoding the wall, a separate group of researchers had begun clearing the outer courtyard of the El Katara temple, a routine excavation to map out the temple's surroundings. What they uncovered wasn't routine at all. Just a few meters from the base of the inscribed wall, buried under less than a meter of wind-packed sand, they began to find bodies. Human remains, at first just a few, but then dozens, all facing downward, arms twisted behind their backs, as though they had been thrown into the ground. Some were missing hands. Others, entire skulls. But there was no sign of violent trauma. No blade cuts. No crushing injuries. The bones hadn't been broken. They had been softened. One forensic expert described it as if the bone had melted internally, like wax under pressure. It didn't match any form of known execution. No sacrificial positioning. No mummification. No burial rites. They were dumped, rapidly and chaotically. But the strangest part, the ground beneath them was scorched. Not burned like firewood. Glassed. Sand turned to blackened, smooth glass, a phenomenon that only occurs at temperatures over 1,700 degrees Celsius. The kind of heat generated by modern explosives. Or something worse. The lab tests took weeks. But when the results came back, one word stood out in red at the bottom of the report. Radiation. There were elevated levels of isotopes around the burial pit, traces of thorium and cesium-137, both rare in nature. No other dig site in Egypt had ever produced radiation readings like this. And this was 3,000 years old. Before electricity. Before engines. Before even the earliest recorded use of iron in the region. So what created that heat? Near one of the skeletons, they also uncovered something else. Something that was never shown in the official reports. A small, perfectly spherical black stone no larger than a coin, smooth as obsidian but pulsing with faint magnetic charge. It didn't match any local geology. Sophia held it in her hand only once, and later said, "It felt wrong, like it was watching back." Some in the team believed it was a ritual item. Others said it might not have been made on Earth at all. And remember the inscribed hand pressed into the wall? A sample was taken from inside the groove. Under UV light, traces of a crystalline dust were detected, something not found elsewhere in the temple. When compared to the residue on the black stone, it matched. In short, the body pit, the glassed sand, the radiation, and the encrypted message inside the temple wall. They were all connected. Someone had tried to document what happened, and then, perhaps, tried to warn the future. Why was it hidden? If this was a warning, why hide it? Why not proclaim it from every temple, every scroll, every priestly mouth in the land? The answer is simple. Someone didn't want it remembered. Sophia's team began to study the architecture of the chamber where the message was found. And something strange emerged. The wall wasn't meant to be read at all. It faced inward, toward a narrow service corridor, a space so cramped, only one person could pass at a time. No offerings placed before it. No ceremonial alignment to the sun or stars. No decorative reliefs. Nothing sacred. It was hidden behind a secondary wall. A wall that had crumbled just enough over centuries for the glyphs to breathe again. Someone had built over it. Most temple walls in ancient Egypt were meant to project power. They were inscribed with praise to the pharaoh, victories in battle, offerings to the gods. They were public affirmations of divine order. But this was a private panic. Written hastily. Carved deep. Hidden. Not for ceremony. For confession. One inscription in a recessed corner read, "He who sees must seal." It wasn't part of the main message. It was scribbled like a footnote, smaller, etched in thinner lines. Egyptologists believe it was a scribe's directive. Whoever carved the glyphs knew they weren't supposed to. But they couldn't bear to leave the truth untold. And there's more. The temple itself showed signs of abandonment. Unlike other temples that were slowly buried by sand or repurposed by later dynasties, this one seemed to have been left in a hurry. Several chambers were unfinished, chisel marks abruptly stopped, statues half-carved. In one room, tools were found still sitting on the floor as if dropped mid-task. And sealed behind a sandstone block in the eastern wall, a bundle of papyrus scrolls, burned. Intentionally. Yet one survived, too charred to open completely, but just legible enough to translate a single phrase. It came. We obeyed. It left. No name. No time. No God. Just that. And silence. So why hide it? Because whatever they were, whatever they did, left more than bodies. It left fear. A fear so deep, the priests of Egypt, the most ceremonially powerful civilization of their time, chose not to honor it, but erase it. Because even memory, they believed, could be contaminated. The message may not be from Earth. They did not breathe. They did not walk. And still, they watched. That's what the wall said. But it wasn't just the words that unsettled the team. It was what came next. Near the center of the spiral, the core of the inscription, Sophia found an anomaly. A cluster of symbols that didn't match any known Egyptian structure, religious term, or royal lexicon. These weren't glyphs at all. They were geometric shapes. A triangle inside a circle. A line split into three. A star with too many points. Repeated. Aligned. Precise. It didn't look like art. It looked like data. When scanned, the pattern produced a curious result, a repeating frequency. Not a word, not a sentence, but a pulse. As if the shapes were meant to be read as sound. One acoustics expert called it a visual harmonic key. Another described it as an encrypted wave signature. But what's even stranger? It matched. When compared against deep space signals, like the famous WOW signal and other unexplained space pulses, the geometric pattern on the temple wall fell within a similar frequency range. Coincidence? Or was this a recording? A trace of a message received, or repeated? The final spiral of glyphs around the shapes seemed to support that idea. They fell once, and shall rise again. The stars did not birth them. The stars remembered them. They are not gods. But what gods fear? Those were the last readable lines. And then, nothing. Sophia stood in silence, looking at the final mark. It wasn't a symbol. It was a map, or at least, it resembled one. A small dot. A curve. A line pointing outward. Almost like a star chart. A directional glyph, pointing somewhere off Earth. Some on the team began to speculate. Could this have been a mythologized alien encounter? A misunderstood natural disaster, turned into cosmic horror? Or, could ancient Egypt have preserved a truth, buried beneath layers of fear and censorship? Not everyone agreed. Many dismissed the translation as overly imaginative, a symptom of modern minds projecting science fiction onto myth. But others weren't so sure. Because deep in another forgotten temple in western Sudan, a nearly identical glyph pattern had just been uncovered. Same spiral. Same shapes. Same silence. And as Sophia would later say in a now-deleted interview, we keep asking, what did the ancients believe? But maybe the better question is, what did they see? What this means for us now. The wall is silent again. The bones are buried. The scrolls have turned to ash. But the question remains. What if this wasn't a myth? What if it wasn't imagination? What if someone really did see something? Because the truth is, we don't know what happened at El Katara. We don't know why a priest buried his testimony inside a wall and sealed it with a handprint. We don't know why the bodies were dumped without names, or why the sand was turned to glass. We don't even know what the silence was. But we know this. The Egyptians were obsessed with memory, with legacy, with keeping the soul intact for eternity. And yet here, in this one temple, someone was more afraid of being remembered than forgotten. What kind of encounter makes a civilization erase its own story? When we talk about ancient history, we like clean categories: gods, myths, rulers, rituals. But there are always outliers, stories that don't fit, incidents that get ignored, inscribed warnings. Erased names. Spirals that point upward. This story, this message, doesn't want to be a myth. It wants to be read. It wants to warn. And maybe, it wants to be remembered now, because something about our time resembles theirs. The madness. The disconnection. The forgetting. So I'll leave you with this. What if it's happening again? What if the silence that eats time wasn't a one-time event, but a cycle? And what if we're already inside it? If that left a chill in your spine, or made you question everything you thought about history, this channel is where the forgotten stories live. Subscribe now, and don't let this warning fade like it did 3,000 years ago. Comment below, was this message a myth, or did they bury a truth the world wasn't ready for? Share this with someone who still thinks the ancients had nothing to fear. Because history isn't dead. It's just hidden.